Perfect. So yeah, that's just what I just mentioned. And today, as you know, we are going to talk about climate change or climate change adaptation in Latin America and the Caribbean. In general, this is the general structure of the presentation, some really general information on climate change, some projected risk and also observed risk in the Latin American region. And at the end, as mentioned before, some information about in the region. As we know, and we have seen this graph or a similar one maybe in the early school, we have the greenhouse effect, which protects us and has allowed life on Earth as we know it. And we have these greenhouse gases, mainly the carbon dioxide, the methane, and also water vapor. And this has allowed that the global mean temperature is in between 13 or 14 degrees as average. But the increase of the greenhouse gases emissions has contributed to what we know as global warming or climate change. And this is coming mainly from anthropogenic sources, so to say, from our activities since the pre-industrial time. Then I like to give some very brief overview about the difference on climate and weather. When we know that the weather, it's between hours and months, is the climate or the weather that we observe, and some phenomena that are present in that time scale are, for example, is rain, the cyclones. Then we have climate variability, which is more between months and decades. And some phenomenon that we found there is the wet season, the dry season, for example, in Central America, or El Niño, and also the Pacific decadal oscillation. And afterwards, we talk about climate change. And climate change is the minimum that we talk about. Climate change is a period of 30 years to centuries. And then in this range, we find the global warming. We know that the planet is warming, and so that's because the climate can change to colder temperatures or to warmer, and in this case, we know that the planet's warming. But we also have some other phenomena like sea level rise or ocean acidification. Having said that, here I present to you some of the recent graphics that the IPCC presented last year, the Working Group 1 report, where we can easily see that in the last 70 years, or since 1850, which is the pre-industrial level, to now, we observe a high increase in the global average temperature, and being at the moment in 1.1. Approximately. And here, this graph I like very much, because here in green you can see what could be the climate in a simulated world where we only consider natural activities. So, and here in the more orange color, we see the information of what has been already observed. Also simulated, but also coming before from paleoclimate information. And then here you observe how similar the trend is in terms of the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. And here also how much fossil fuels and land use has been burning, or how much land use change has happened in the world in the last centuries, and those trends are all similar. I like to remember, and because this was not so clear some years ago, I have been following the UNFCCC negotiations since 2010, and by then we were still talking about future climate change. But we know, and every day is more clear, that the climate change is our present, and also that is not warming the same everywhere. Here we see a nice images from Show Your Stripes, where here we see the global temperature change. The blue color are the years that are below the global average, and the red ones are the ones above the global average. Here we see the information for Europe only, and afterwards an example of how can be seen that in Nicaragua, considering that there may be less information available. Then going to the Latin American region, we have to keep in mind that, and for sure you know that the issue of climate change also presents some issues of inequality. And for example, the region which is mentioned as one of the most vulnerable regions has been contributing to the problem only with 9% of the global historic emissions. Some exception increasing of carbon dioxide in the region are Belize, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, and Guatemala. But also some countries have increased their forest cover, like Uruguay, Cuba, San Vincent, Chile, Costa Rica. And this is just to show that yes, the region is somehow also responsible, but there are also some countries on the good track in order to change those negative trends. And then here, for example, you see how different, you observe here all the regions, and then afterwards only South America, and this is the contribution of the region. Talking about annual carbon dioxide emissions. Then who emits the most? We have, this is current data. So considering all the development that has occurred in the last decade, we have China at the moment as being the higher emitter, then followed by the USA and the European Union. But that shows the current scenario, but you saw before how different is in terms of historical responsibilities or historical emissions. Then where are those emissions from Latin America coming from? They are mostly coming from the energy sector, but also the agriculture and change in land use and forestry activities could have a big contribution. And in a minor part, the industrial processes, waste, or bunker fuel. But we know also that the Latin America region has a good potential for renewable energies, but with this information from 2015 from the CEPAL, from the UN, we see that by then the Latin American region had only 25% of the energy matrix as coming from renewable energies. In the region, we also find some inequalities. You may know that Latin America is one, if not the most unequal region in the world. And within the region, we have sub-regions as Central America, where you can see that in this graph that the level of poverty and extreme poverty have been reduced in the last years. However, at the moment, we still have around 40% of the people living under poverty. But that people that already lives under poverty are also have been more and more affected in the last decades by extreme events as floods, as a storm or hurricanes. And for example, in winter and in rainy season for Latin America or Central America in 2020, there was the impact of two major hurricanes, Eta and Iota, within 10 days in almost the exact same region. And millions of people were affected by it. And this is the kind of extreme events that could influence the migration patterns in the region that you may have seen in the news, some information. So about 2020 and this hurricane season, by September of that year, we have already covered all the list of tropical cyclone names, which the tropical cyclone season starts around July. And then by September, it's already covered. So here we see, or the next part of the list, where we got to the Greek alphabet. That is, this is the third option used by the National Hurricane Center of the US. And here you see the path that both of the hurricanes or the cyclones follow, where both of them, one being category 4 and the other category 5, which are the stronger ones, they hit almost the same town in Nicaragua, in the Caribbean region, which is also one of the most where the poverty levels are the highest also. And they follow a similar track in Nicaragua going through Honduras. And you know, this is just where the eye of the cyclone impacted, but all of this was covered by heavy extreme rains in the region. Even floods in Nicaragua, here in the south or in Costa Rica, were reported. And the aftermath of that we're talking about November 2020 is this. And this is Bilwi. This is the town where the cyclones almost impacted with some kilometers of differences. And you see how everything was lost for many families, and included this lady that actually worked with a friend of mine, and they lost everything. So this is the kind of situations that population or people in Central America are already facing with current climate change. And here, I just wanted to show you a video, but I'm not sure if the sound will work now. Maybe you can try. Can you hear it? Can you hear the no? No. Okay. So okay, then I can share with you afterwards the link. Sorry for that. It's just that I forgot about sharing the audio, and I'm not sure if I can change it now. But here is just to show how the families were exposed and were facing this kind of very extreme events within less than 15 days, which means that the government, but also the community, have to face this situation and move from their properties and face a very difficult and challenging situation in very short time. And here is what also interesting for me is that just in the days after the cyclones hit the region, the World Bank or different institutions announced that they were supporting Central America for their recovery. For example, here you see here the headlines: the World Bank supports Honduras, or Nicaragua receive emergency funding. But if you go more than the headlines of this information, you see that this money are credits, are not development aid or anything, are credits for our countries, which means that the most vulnerable population, who are already facing this kind of extreme events, are also getting in debt in order to face and improve their situation after the extreme events. So this is a matter of injustice also, right? They are getting debts in order to recover. So having said this, very like the context of what we are living now, we also know that the climate science is increasing more and more. And the climate science is evaluated and assessed and presented by the IPCC every 5 or 7 years. And the information that I will present now will be focused on these 3 reports. The report on the 1.5 degrees, in which I participated or contributed. This was published a little bit more than 3 years ago. Then 2 more special reports of the IPCC were published in 2019. But in August last year, and just a few days ago, the IPCC presented the contributions of the working group 1 and the working group 3 of the IPCC. The working group 1 is the one related to the science, to say what's happening in the climate system. And the working group 2 is the one related to impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And the ones that are still under preparation is the working group 3. That one is related to mitigation. And in September will be published the synthesis report, which covers all or synthesize the information from all these reports that are part of the 6th assessment cycle of the IPCC. So in 2018, the 1.5 report already mentioned for rainforests that we know are one of the most important ecosystems in Latin America, that at a level of global warming of 1.5 degrees or even less, we will observe reduction of biomass, deforestation, and fire increases, and also forest dieback. At 2 degrees, those impacts will be larger. And in a range of 2 or 3 degrees of global warming, we could even observe replacement of rainforests by savanna or grassland. So that is a serious and drastic change in the ecosystems in the region. And there could be potential tipping point leading also to forest dieback. And we know, for example, that the rainforest and the Amazon, or the Amazon itself, is an important element of the climate system. For the case of Central American forests, it was said also that there could be replacement of rainforests at a degree of 3 or 4 degrees of global warming. For the Amazon, the tipping point, it could be between 3 or 4 degrees, or if we observe a deforestation of around 40% of the Amazons. That will mean a stronger El Niño events in the region. And El Niño, most of the news that we see here in Europe are related to floods, but in Central America, for example, El Niño, it means droughts or less precipitation. In terms of an agricultural system, at 1.5, we could observe a reduction of about 10% and larger at 2 degrees. And also it could be observed between 2 or 3. There could be potential tipping points for collapse of maize crop in some regions. That we know that maize, for example, is one of the basic products, mainly from small scale farmers from Latin America, especially Mesoamerica, like Mexico, Central America. Then if we go to the Caribbean, for example, there was the impacts or the risk could be persistent heat stress for livestock, water stress, again, their coastal erosion, the decrease in weaker tropical storms, but increase in the number of intense storms, and loss of coral reefs. That also we know that they are important for the ecosystem, for fisheries, but also for tourism in the region. And of course, the impacts on the tourism also were mentioned. And that is information that have been also updated in the latest reports. And here, when we see, for example, the information of the working group 1, which, as I mentioned before, is the one in charge of the physical science basis of climate change, the IPCC said we are already living in a 1.09 warmer than if we compare to pre-industrial times. And what this graph says here, you may identify this is the shape of the regions of the world, and the hexagons, what they identify is where each of the extremes are identified. And so for Latin America, hot extremes are identified already. And then we have for heavy precipitation, there is not so much information about it. You can see that the regions that have the better and more information are Europe and Asia. And then in terms of agricultural and ecological droughts, there is again a big lack of information for the region. And now if we go to the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability part of these reports of the IPCC, we observe that there is growing evidence or scientific knowledge that give us a better understanding of what's happening in the different regions of the world. And just an example of how much work the IPCC reports imply. Here are some figures. This report, which is the one presented last week, implied the work of around 270 authors. They were coming from 67 countries, around 40% were women. There were around almost 700 country authors. They revised more than 34,000 scientific papers, most of them produced since 2014. That is when the previous report was presented. And also the authors receive around more than 60,000 review comments. And important is also that 43% of the authors were coming from developing countries, which is a better number than in previous assessments of the IPCC. So we see that there is also an effort to integrate more authors and scientists from developing countries. And the main message of the report that you may have seen the headlines last week, and maybe you are still, the media is still multiplying the information, is that the scientific evidence is unequivocal. The climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet, and that any further delay and concerted global action will miss the brief, rapidly closing window to secure a lively future. And also the report also includes some kind of solutions for this very not a situation that we are living. In respect to Central America, again, here we can see the synthesis of observed and projected impacts to main sectors in the region. And the region was at the same time subdivided in some other sub-regions, because we know Latin America is not an homogeneous region in terms of ecosystems, in terms of geographical situation. So they have to do this division in order to have a better overview of what are the impacts. But here, if you go to the Central American region, you observe that there is, again, a huge or a big lack of scientific information about observed impacts, but also about the projected impacts. And that is, for example, the Northwest South American region has more information. The bigger and the more intense the colors, that means that there is more information. And you can see that there is an imbalance on where we can find information on what. And what could be here, for example, for the Southwest South American region, which is Peru, Bolivia, Chile, for example, you see that there is high confidence, and also in terms of the impacts to terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. And that is high confidence in terms of observed impacts, so the ones that we are already living with, and the projected ones. And this is kind of an overview or of what the information about the region that we can find in the report. Here you can see these words, because this is our screenshot of the available report, which is not yet final. It needs a final editing, so sorry for that, but that's what it's available at the moment. And in the graph here, you can see the hazards in the different subregions of Latin America. And you can see that they consider hazards related to temperature, to cold spells, to extreme precipitation, extreme heat, etc. And then also they identify where and what it has been observed and what is also projected for each of the regions. And in this one at your right, you can see also something that is interesting, and it was already identified in the previous assessment, but now it's more clear and there is a lot more of information about it, and it's related to the historical changes in suitability for malaria transmission, for example. And we see that for the southeast or in north area for Costa Rica, for example, there is a hotspot for malaria, but also in Guatemala, in the border with Mexico, but also we find a big hotspot in Brazil. And you see, this is how the disease may migrate in the region also, or where there would be more suitable areas for the transmission of, this case, malaria. And then the report also covers vulnerability, and you find again from all Central and South American subregions, Central America is the one with very high levels of vulnerabilities. And the only one that is not so high in this case are the terrestrial and freshwater ecosystem. But compared with the others, is the one that it is already in bad shape, so to say. And related to climate risk, again, and when we talk about risk, is the future, no? The previous, this one, vulnerability is observed, vulnerability is what the region is the picture of the region at the moment, but here when we talk about risk is the future. And if we see the region it is expected to have more than 2.5 degrees of increase of temperature. And the risks observed in the region are food insecurity, where Central and South America are the regions mentioned. Then we have floods and landslide, water insecurity, and so on. And these statements, when you see at the end, they say medium to high confidence, and that's related to the available literature. And if you remember just some slides before, I was mentioning the gap of knowledge in the region. So it may be that some of these risks that are identified as medium confidence would be even higher if we would have more literature available. And it is because of this gap of knowledge and lack of scientific literature that if you go to the summary for policymaker, and I think I will just in a couple of slides afterwards, I will present it. There is a communication tool that the IPCC has been using, which is the reasons for concern of the burning embers, where they try to identify the different level of risk and impacts at different level of temperature. And for small islands in Central and South America, that information could not be developed because there is not enough literature again. Here, it's just an interesting graph that is related to the sensitivity of ocean and coastal ecosystems and exclusive economic zones to climate change and non-climate drivers in Central and South America. And we can see, for example, drivers related to ocean warming are related to coral reef, and those are also affecting North and South America, but also are related to, coral reef are related here to Central America, and there you can see the connection. And I haven't studied too much this graph, but I saw it yesterday and I found it really interesting because it's a reflex of how connected we are, no? Or the ecosystems are, and how everything depends on the well-being or the health of our planet. And here is the image, the diagram that I was mentioning before, where, for example, you see the level of risk and impacts identified in the previous Working Group 2 report, which was published in 2014. And here you can see that for unique and threatened systems, among them are the coral reef or the Amazon region, at 1 degree, the level was high. But if we observe the latest information, at 1.5, we are also at high level of risk, but at 1.5 it's already at very high risk. And here I'm very sorry, the lines are not correct, but here you could see that the transition from high to very high levels of risk was only identified at around 2 degrees of global warming, while in this case, we already have very high level of risk at 2 degrees. So it's not the transition, but it's already the very high level of risk that has been identified. If we compare the extreme events, for example, hurricanes and so on, exactly here we have the information. We have at 1 degree in 2014, according to the available literature by time, a moderate level of risk by them, because we were not at 1 degree. But then at this moment, we have already the transition from moderate to high level of risk. And so you can identify this difference in the rest of the reasons for concern. This diagram is called the burning embers because of the colors. But you see that only 7 years afterwards, we have, or the scientific community has identified that the climate system, but also the natural systems and also the society is more sensible or more sensitive to this level of warming. So we see a lot of purple, more purple in this latest report, and that is some reason for concern, as the diagrams are called. And about the biodiversity, here you see also how different it could be if we limit the global warming to 1.5. If we compare to 3 degrees of global warming, we see more regions with a red color, which means that are regions that could face biodiversity losses. Then, in general terms, the report identified heat stress, and the exposure to heat waves will continue to increase with additional warming. About water scarcity, it's identified that at 2 degrees, regions relying on, for example, snow melt could experience 20% decline in water availability. Among them, for example, the Andean regions in South America. About food security, climate change will increase and undermine food security and flood risk. About 1 billion people living in low-lying cities by the sea and or small islands at risk from sea level rise by mid-century. Then it's true, I mean, the report left us with some alarming information, as you may have seen now, but also it gives a message of hope. And that message of hope is summarized in this graph, so to say, that we have to increase the urgency, and for that we have to start working or really with ambitious action today. Every action and decision matters, and that is also a message that was included in the 1.5 report in 2018. And what this diagram or figure says is that we have, these are the past conditions. These are the decisions that we have already made. And by the time being, for example, by 2022, we are here and we still have some choices. we still have the choices that include climate action, so to say, adaptation, mitigation, all together, and considering also the achievement of the sustainable development goals. And all together, we could have well-being, low poverty, ecosystem health, equity and justice, and these kind of principles in which our society should be based. But if we continue delaying action, if we continue working on silos or not considering climate action in the development work, or also in the implementation of the sustainable development goals, we are just building more vulnerability. We could face high levels of poverty, ecosystem degradation, and so on and so forth. And what this aligns on the top says, or these are actually the decisions that, or the path that we already missed because of past decisions. So this will be a really sustainable planet with less poverty, with good well-being around the world. But sadly, we already are, these options for us are already gone, but there is still some pathways that could take us to a better scenarios than the one we may face if we don't do anything. And then talking about that is, I will go quickly to what is climate action. And you may already know, we have mainly three approaches, which are related to the negotiations of climate change, related to the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, which are mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And mitigation, we know, is to reduce global warming, or is to reduce the emissions to the atmosphere. Adaptation is to face the already changing conditions and to adapt to those, so that we can still implement our activities, or the ecosystems can still be maintained. And loss and damages is what happens, for example, in the case of Central America and extreme events, that entire communities face extreme events, and they lose their households or their livelihoods and everything that implies. And what here I wanted to share is that the more we mitigate, the adaptation needs may be less, and also the losses and damage that we face in the future. However, if we continue delaying action and we continue being dependent on fossil fuels, we will face major needs for adaptation, but also major losses and damages around the world. Because I'm aware that these kind of extreme events are not only faced or being observed in the Latin American region, we also see them in Europe, for example. You may remember last summer in Germany, the floods in the Ruhr region, which were really extreme. So we can still avoid a big part or a big share of those impacts that are projected. So here it's just a diagram to show that there are limits of acceptance risk, and to those we could adapt, but there are some adaptation limits. And above those adaptation limits is where we face the losses and damages. And this is a diagram from the previous assessment report, and the current report of the working group 2 already gives a lot of attention on adaptation limits, on maladaptation also. And if we ask about an example of adaptation limit is, for example, communities in the Central American dry corridors, which are communities already facing droughts, and they don't have the access to finance to face those droughts, and therefore they cannot adapt. as a small scale farmers, for example. And there is the decision sometimes that they face to migrate from those communities that are already facing extreme conditions as reduce of the reduction of precipitation, for example. And about climate action, we know that there is every year we know, or we are not happy with what the COPs conclude. Right? The COPs are the conferences of the parties of the United Nations framework on climate change. And here is a diagram that shows that even when we started talking about or negotiating on climate change in 1992, since then we have observed most of the increase in temperature around the world. And this is to say that there is the science, there is the policy, and at the moment the policy has not followed the science, but it's time to do it. And therefore, it's important, you may have heard some of the results of the COP26 that happened in Glasgow. And this one was a conference that was delayed by a year because of the pandemic. But it was, for me, it's still not enough what they agree, but it gave me a lot of hope to see how much the information delivered by the IPCC in September, August last year was included in the discussion this time. In the decisions, they mentioned the level of global warming. They say that this is needed, these rapid and unprecedented actions, that the indices are still not enough, and the climate change is happening around the world. So that is included in the negotiation text. And here we can see how good or not good the national determined contributions, which are the pledges or the compromise from the governments to meet the Paris Agreement. And we see that they are really far away from achieving the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5. We are really not in the good track yet. We are in the middle track, because in the climate area we talk about the worst case scenario and the best case scenario. So we are at the moment in the mid scenario, following the 4.5 RCP or socioeconomic pathways. And we see here there is still a big gap between the climate action that is promised to happen, because the NDCs are promises still, and the climate action that is needed to happen. So the window of time is closing. And these pledges from the governments are still taking us to a plus 2.7 global warmer or warmer world. And this is really far away from the 1.5 limit established in the Paris Agreement. Now, if we are talking, it may be that the climate change will continue to happen and we cannot limit it according to the Paris Agreement. We need to adapt. And that is happening already in the last decades. And adaptation, as I was mentioned to you before, is an adjustment to the actual and also future risks of global warming that also can happen at the society level, but also from the natural systems. And here, this graph is just to say that even if we stop now emitting greenhouse gases, we still will face some global warming. So we need to start adapting now in order to avoid worst case scenarios in terms of how we face the risk around the world. And in that case, also, we need to mention that the action that we take now, it will be always cheaper than to wait the climate to, or the extreme events to happen more and more. So every dollar or euro that we invest now on adaptation, it has a lot of benefits in the future than waiting to act. And that's the same case also for mitigation. And important is to mention that there is an imbalance in the climate finance. So what the countries pledge on terms of money for climate action, UN report last year said that only 5% of all the money on the table is allocated to adaptation. And that's really little when we consider that are billions of people around the world facing climate change, and those people are also living in vulnerable conditions. Adaptation can happen at different levels. It can happen at the local level, municipalities, for example, avoiding flood risk, like dams or nature-based solutions implemented in the communities, but also happens the instruments that guide adaptation happen also at the national level, for example, the national adaptation plans or the national determined contributions. And then at the global level, we have the global goal on adaptation, which was established by the Paris Agreement in 2015. And this is just to say, adaptation is not only a local matter, it also is guided by global policies. And here I share with you, this is part of the contribution. I mean, I contributed a little bit to these results that were presented by the working group too, where the report mentions, this is not an assessment done regionally, so it's not for Latin America, it's globally, but here we can start seeing that even that adaptation is happening, but adaptation also have some limitations. And for in terms of feasibility of adaptation, for example, forest-based adaptation has a high level of feasibility. So to say, it could be easy to be implemented, while sustainable aquaculture has a medium feasibility, agroforestry has also a medium feasibility, and so on. And so the report includes this kind of assessment of different, not all, it is not a comprehensive assessment, but it's an assessment of measures already identified in the 1.5 report. And also we can identify the synergies that those options have with mitigation, and also the synergies they have with the sustainable development goal. And here it's obvious to see that most of the adaptation measures have positive impacts on the sustainable development goals. Going to the region again, we see this kind of assessment where another UN report said last year that almost all Latin American region has some, with some exceptions, have a national adaptation plan, strategies, laws, and policies in place. Also here, it's like where most of the money or where most of the projects funded by the top 10 bilateral donors are taking place. And we see that, for example, Argentina, Chile have no projects being implemented, but most of the projects are implemented either in Peru or Brazil, Mexico, Guatemala has a darker color there. So here you can see also a picture of how adaptation may be happening in the region. And if we consider adaptation and the pandemic, the UNEP report did an analysis of how much the countries were integrating adaptation in their recovery plans. And here you see that only Costa Rica somehow included some measures, but then it's Colombia, the only country that has some kind of climate risk integrated plans related or integrated in their COVID recovery plans. in terms of the NDCs, that, as I mentioned before, is the national determined contributions. Those are the plans presented by the countries to comply with the Paris Agreement. We see here in a report from Moreno, it's from European Commission, that, for example, most of the Latin American countries have identify adaptation measures, and many of them are related to agriculture, to water, are the sector that have most of the measures, and then others have scattered or have more distributed measures. But for example, if we see transport is a sector that is not well represented in the NDCs, then we have cities. So most of the measures are actually connected to forest, to ecosystem, to agriculture or rural areas, but not really to urban areas where most of the population is actually living. Then the working group 2, the chapter 12 report, did also an analysis of the type and amount of adaptation goals included in the identifying the national action plans related to ocean and coastal systems. And here you see, for example, Chile has a good number of adaptation goals. Those are more related to research and monitoring. Then regarding biodiversity and conservation is Guatemala. Brazil has also a good work on or plans on research and monitoring. And there you can see like also an overview of what the countries are identifying in regards to adaptation, in this case for the ocean and coastal systems. This is a more comprehensive report which was published in 2020, but also based in previous information. And you can see that in different regions of Latin America, some adaptation measures are already implemented, but also most of them are related to policies. So they are not really actions. So we see we still have this gap between what we plan and what we implement. And in the Latin American region, that gap is still big. But also I wanted to mention, I will finish soon, but I didn't want to stop without mentioning the importance of adaptation of indigenous people in Latin America, and also related to adaptation, where we have countries with a huge percentage of population being indigenous people, mostly in Mexico and Guatemala. And we identify here that even when indigenous people are those that have helped a lot or have preserved the natural ecosystem, they also have some aspects of vulnerabilities, which are, for example, the poverty and inequality, the loss of livelihoods based on natural resources, the forced migration that they face in some areas, the gender inequality, and so on. And these aspects, I mentioned them because they are also related to adaptation. We cannot implement adaptation without considering reduction of poverty, for example, or without considering reduction of inequality in the region. And here, just confirming how important indigenous people are for the region, and is that deforestation, in this paper, they identify that deforestation is reduced in indigenous lands relative to non-protected areas across the tropics. So the lands where we find indigenous people or communities managing those lands are the ones that have less degrees of deforestation around the world, actually. And here we see an example of how indigenous communities are also trying to share their knowledge in terms of adaptation and mitigation to climate change. This is chapter 13 of the the Guatemalan report on climate change, where they, as mentioned before, Guatemala is one of the countries with a lot of indigenous people, and they are taking into account what they have to say in terms of climate change. Coming almost to an end, again, we identify here in this paper that Latin America in general there is little information regarding to adaptation in the region. We see this is analysis made based on scientific literature, on scientific journals, what is published about the region. And this part is related to where authors working on adaptations are coming from or are affiliated. And we see very little in Latin America. And here is regarding the areas that are covered in that adaptation literature. And we see again that Latin America, together with Africa and other regions, are also almost absent in the scientific literature. And that is reflected, of course, in the IPCC reports. Then, in order to some efforts to fill that gap of information, we at the Climate Service Center developed the regional climate fact sheets. This is a case that we did in Costa Rica with a sub-basin, and is that basically what we identify there, or what we present there, is the most relevant climate information for any of the regions. Regarding the cost of adaptation is what I mentioned before. The total cost of the impacts are also increasing if global warming increase, and they could represent between 1.5 to 4.3% of the GDP of the region, while the cost of adaptation would not exceed 0.5% of the regional GDP. So that is where we see what I mentioned before, that adaptation is cheaper than not doing anything at all. Then in September last year, the governments from the region met, and one of the major calls that they did by then, it was the call on climate finance for adaptation. This was really relevant, but this is the political space. What is really happening in the region is that the region is not prioritizing adaptation to climate change. Here, for example, is a general indicator of how sustainable the national budgets are, and this is with information with 2019. And those that presented a better rank are Jamaica, Colombia, and Nicaragua, but all of them were less than 1% categorized as sustainable budget, less than 1%. So any of the countries did a good job there. And in terms of mitigation and adaptation, we see here, this is the money coming from bilateral cooperation, and 95% of the money coming from bilateral cooperation was invested on mitigation, and only 4% to adaptation. And we see Latin America has a leader contribution to in terms of emissions, but has a higher impacts, but the countries are investing the money in not considering those impacts. Like, at least that's my analysis. And then if we consider the money that is allocated by the Green Climate Fund, which is the major funder from the UN in terms of climate change finance, we see again that almost 70% of that money goes only to mitigation, 16% goes to adaptation, and 15% goes to projects that mix both approaches. Summarizing, I mean, I know that I have presented a lot of information, but the takeaway messages is that we are already living in a global, in a warmer world, 1.1, warmer world, The higher the level of warming, the higher the risk and needs of adaptation action and the risk of losses and damages. Impacts are not the same in the regions of the world, and not even in Latin America. We have seen that they could be really different. The global policies guide action, but actions also happen at the local level. When planning adaptation, we have to consider different aspects, not only those environmental aspects, but also including uncertainty of the scenarios, gender, local knowledge, socioeconomic conditions, etc. And an aspect that I also wanted to mention are the limits for adaptation. We have, again, the choice where to go. We need to reduce climate risk, and we need to do it by implementing adaptation. We need to reduce the greenhouse gases emission, and that is called, we know, is mitigation. We need to enhance our biodiversity, because they offer some solutions also to the problem, but they are also threatened by climate change. And we need to achieve the sustainable development goals, and all these aspects are included in the so-called climate resilient development pathways. And those were the different pathways that I was showing before. And these are basically the two options. We have a good world and another one that is not so good for anyone, not for us and not for the ecosystems. We need to start now again. We have to do it fast. We have to do a lot. And I close the presentation with the messages of the 1.5 report that were really clear, where they say every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year or the time that we go by matters, and every choice that we do at the very different spaces where we have influence, they also matter. So thanks a lot. I hope you are not overwhelmed.